4 p.m. in Moscow. You're watching RT International with me, Marina Jashi. Ukraine's southern city of Odessa is mourning the dozens killed on Friday in an arrest that engulfed previously peaceful area. Please be warned, you may find some of the following videos upsetting. Well, a violent confrontation between pro and anti-government protesters ended in more than 40 people being burned alive in a barricaded trade union building. Radical nationalists threw Molotov cocktails in through the windows after anti-Kiev activists took refuge in the building, which soon caught fire. People trapped by the flames leapt from the windows, but some of those who made it out were then brutally beaten. We managed to speak to some of the survivors.
Women and children were hiding in the trade union building. At first, the armed men burned down tents, but then started throwing Molotov cocktails and grenades at the building. We heard shots fired and saw smoke.
There were about 50 of us on the roof, men and women. The right sector was blocking the streets. We looked down at what was happening around us and thought they wouldn't let us out alive. People from other floors were brought down, and the extremists attacked them like a pack of wolves. Then the police escorted us from the building. We had to step over dead bodies when we were coming down the stairs.
Now, several people were also killed in violence that broke out in central Odessa before the deadly fire. Pro-Kiev football fans and ultranationalists clashed with anti-government protesters. Hundreds of people from both camps taking part in scuffles. Pro-government activists later destroyed their opponent's tent city. Maria Finoshna is in Odessa and recaps how the situation unfolded.
The clashes between those protesting against the country's new authorities. Witnesses say there were around 100 of them, and those supporting the country's new government, people in Kiev. Reportedly a group 3 times bigger started here from the city's central Grecheska, or Greek square. It lasted for 2 hours. Up to 4 people were killed and many others injured. It stopped when police arrived to the scene. But it was not the end. The supporters of the interim government in Kiev, joined by football fans reportedly coming from neighboring regions, came here to where for weeks those who do not recognize Ukraine's new authorities have been protesting. The so-called pro-Maidan activists first burned down their tents. They were here in front of the building on this square, and then set on fire the trade union's headquarters that you can see behind me at the time when several people were inside. Eyewitnesses say they barricaded the entrance that you can see over there, preventing people from leaving, and started throwing Molotov cocktails through the windows. People inside started suffocating as a result. More than 30 died. Many of them burned alive. Others were killed while trying to jump out of the windows.
I saw at least 6 people jumping from the building. I think they're dead. I carried some people with head wounds. At the same time, there were shots from behind the backs of the security forces. Someone was firing a machine gun. We have the empty shells to prove it.
For several hours after that, around 50 people remained trapped on the rooftop of this building until police arrived to the scene and saved them. What happened in Odessa on Friday changed the mood here in the town dramatically. And now no one can say for sure what is going to happen next. Maria Finoshna, RT from Odessa in Ukraine.
Now, Russia holds Kiev responsible for the Odessa tragedy. President Putin has pulled no punches when describing the situation, as RT's Igor Piskunov now explains.
Well, the president has outlashed at the current authorities in Kiev, holding them responsible for the violence in southeastern Ukraine, saying that their hands are now covered in blood. Commenting on the ongoing military operation there, Putin says Kiev and its Western sponsors are only provoking more violence, and that now not Russia nor any other outside player has any influence over those people living in those parts of Ukraine. They're not going to put their weapons down, knowing that their lives are continuously being threatened. All of this is according to the president's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, who also added that anyone who presents Kiev's actions as legitimate are criminals themselves. We also know that the president is closely monitoring the events unfolding in Ukraine, also from the angle of Russia's further actions. He's deeply concerned not only about the situation there in the country itself, but also about the way it's being presented in the West, saying that what type of democratic elections in Ukraine could Western nations be talking about with an ongoing military operation conducted by Kiev against its own citizens. Putin also added that the West either doesn't understand what's really happening there on the ground or has chosen not to understand it.
Well, Russia's foreign ministry is urging the interim authorities in Kiev to stop condoning the radicals. And here's the ministry's reaction.
The tragic events that occurred on the 2nd of May in Odessa are considered by Moscow as another expression of the criminal negligence of the authorities in Kiev, who condone the insolent actions of the radical nationalists, including the right sector, that are waging physical terrorism against supporters of federalization and of the true constitutional changes in Ukrainian society. We unequivocally condemn this. Together with an ongoing punitive operation conducted by the current Kiev authorities in Slavyansk, the tragedy in Odessa has become yet another example of Kiev using force and intimidation, which has nothing to do with the obligations imposed by the 21st of February agreement, as well as the 17th of April Geneva Agreement.
Now, the West responded with accusations of its own. Some politicians resorted to ill-timed humor and even tried to put the blame for the tragic events on the victims. Washington's denounced the violence as unacceptable, but failed to mention the pro-Kiev radicals behind it. Ganesh Shikam has the details.
It's interesting, the headlines and tweets that we've seen coming from major U.S. and European news outlets do not mention that those who were torched in Odessa were anti-Kiev activists and that it was done by a group of radicals. Then you have the Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt actually suggesting that it's the quote-unquote pro-Russians' fault that they were burned to death. He writes, horrible with at least 38 dead in Odessa seems to have started with pro-Russian attempt to get control of buildings. Violence must stop. Then he tweets again, pro-Russian thugs getting active and violent in Odessa as well. Unfortunately not unexpected, but Odessa is a city open to all of Europe. Other officials spoke in more generic terms when commenting on the radicals' attack on anti-Kiev protesters without mentioning who has carried out the attacks. British Foreign Secretary, for example, wrote, I deplore and regret the loss of life in Odessa. There is an urgent need for restraint and stepping back from confrontation. Then here in the U.S., you have pundits and foreign policy experts like the head of the Brookings think tank who wrote, Putinshina, a consequence of Putinism, a word to add to our vocabulary of our time, reaches Odessa with flames and blood. Again, Mr. Talbot is somehow suggesting that the Russian president is responsible for the killings and not the pro-Kiev radicals who have actually attacked these people in Odessa. We hear no clear denunciation of this kind of violence coming from U.S. officials. They have firmly sided themselves with authorities in Kiev, and everyone in Ukraine who opposes the government in Kiev, in the view of Washington, just receives their instructions from Moscow.
One of the biggest concerns that we've seen is the Russian propaganda that has been blasted out nonstop, suggesting somehow that the Ukrainian government is responsible for the problems in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has shown remarkable restraint throughout this process.
President Obama spoke earlier after his meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel and basically dismissed the whole protest against Kiev as sponsored and controlled by Russia and put the responsibility for de-escalation on Moscow alone. President Obama also showed full support for Kiev's crackdown on the protests in the east of Ukraine. He called it a move to restore order.
International relations academic Mark Sloboda from Moscow State University believes Western powers are forgetting that they were the ones to open this Pandora's box.
They will continue to blame Russia as being responsible for this, for destabilizing the situation in the Ukraine. By their view, they had a right to destabilize the situation in Ukraine a few months ago and help bring this putsch regime to power with the Euromaidan riots. But now, Russia, although there is no evidence, they claim has no right to destabilize the situation in the rest of the country. These radicals have not been stopped by the government because they are doing the business of this government. These brown shirt paramilitaries are the only true believers that this government can politically and ideologically rely on. The Ukrainian flag flying over a burned building full of the corpses of dead and charred citizens is a perfect metaphor for the way this regime will govern the Ukraine if they're given the chance.